The airport lights were too bright for a goodbye like this. They washed everything in white: faces, floors, intentions, so nothing looked as cruel as it really was. I stood frozen in the middle of Nashville International Airport, holding my purse tight against my chest like it was the last proof that I still belonged somewhere. I had no suitcase, no boarding pass, no ticket, just a thin sweater, a folded itinerary that suddenly meant nothing, and the echo of footsteps walking away from me. "You know what, Mom?" The words still rang in my ears. "We only bought you a one-way ticket." She said it calmly, casually, as if she were telling me the weather forecast instead of quietly cutting me loose. "The return trip?" she added, already turning away. "You'll figure it out." Her designer suitcase rolled smoothly into the first-class security lane. She didn't look back. Not once. She smiled, the kind of smile people wear when they think honesty excuses cruelty. "You've got a phone," she called over her shoulder. "Call someone. Or sell it. That should cover a Greyhound, right?" My son didn't stop her. Didn't defend me. Didn't even meet my eyes. He adjusted his sunglasses and followed her through the checkpoint like this moment had been agreed upon long before today. And just like that, they were gone. Gone into the tunnel of gates and vacation selfies. Gone with my suitcase. Gone with my dignity. I stood there alone. A woman paused in a place that never stops moving. The airport swallowed me whole. Boarding announcements rang out overhead. Wheels clacked against tile. Laughter bounced between glass walls. A family rushed past, arguing about seat assignments. A couple kissed goodbye near the escalator. No one noticed the woman who had just been abandoned. A polite smile flickered across one stranger's face before slipping into pity when her eyes dropped to the empty space beside me. That look hurt more than anger ever could. I tightened my grip on my purse and breathed shallow, careful breaths. I refused to cry. Not here. Not where grief would turn into spectacle. Hours earlier, I had believed this trip meant something. They called it a family getaway. A healing trip. Something to help me after the funeral. My husband had been gone only 2 months. 42 years married. 42 years of shared mornings, quiet arguments, inside jokes no one else understood. They said I needed air. Sunday distraction. They said family should stick together. So I trusted them. Now I realized the itinerary in my hand had always been for show. I had never been meant to come back. I had never been meant to be part of this trip at all. I lowered myself onto a bench near the wall, back straight, chin lifted. Pride was the only thing I had left, and I would not let it crumble in public. Inside my purse, my phone rested heavy in my palm. The last object that proved I still existed. I didn't open it. Instead, my fingers brushed against something else. Something hidden. Something I had forgotten was there until this exact moment. A small envelope. Thin. Quiet. Pressed close to my heart. They thought leaving me here ended my story. But as the boarding announcement echoed again through the terminal, one thought rose above the noise. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something they never expected. What was hidden in the envelope she carried so close to her heart, and why would it change everything that happened next? I stayed on that bench longer than I needed to, not because I didn't know what to do, but because moving felt like admitting this was real. As long as I stayed still, part of me believed they might come back. That Mark would suddenly appear at the end of the concourse, waving, embarrassed, saying there had been a mistake. He didn't. The minutes slid by unnoticed. The airport clock changed, indifferent and exact. Flights boarded. Flights departed. Names were called over the loudspeaker, none of them mine. I focused on small details to keep myself steady. The chill of the metal bench through my coat. The faint smell of coffee and disinfectant. The hum of conversation that rose and fell like waves I no longer belonged to. I told myself not to think about why this had happened yet. Just survive the moment. Ask questions later. My phone buzzed again. Still nothing from Mark. That silence said more than words ever could. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking now, no matter how much I tried to control them. Old hands. Capable hands. Hands that had buttoned tiny shirts, wiped tears, cooked meals, signed permission slips, held a man's hand through sickness and age. Hands that had never imagined being empty like this. A memory surfaced without warning. Standing in my kitchen months earlier, rain tapping softly against the window, the house unbearably quiet after the funeral. Mark had stood across from me, keys in his hand, not quite looking at my face. "Mom, you can't stay stuck here forever," he'd said gently. "You need movement." Movement. That word echoed now as people rushed past me, full of momentum and purpose, while I remained still. I had believed him then. Believed they were worried about me. Believed this trip was an invitation, not an exit. I stood up slowly, my knees stiff, my balance uncertain. For a second, the room tilted. I steadied myself against the wall, breathing through the wave of dizziness. No one came to help. No one ever does when your pain doesn't look dramatic enough. I walked toward the large glass windows overlooking the runway. Planes lined up like promises being kept for other people. I watched one pull away from the gate, its engine roaring to life, and felt something inside me crack. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough to change me. I thought about calling someone. A friend. A neighbor. Anyone. But the idea of explaining this, of saying the words "my own son left me here," made my chest tighten. I wasn't ready to give my humiliation a voice. Instead, I reached into my purse again, my fingers brushing that envelope once more. I didn't open it. I just needed to feel it there. Solid. Real. A reminder that I hadn't come into this world helpless, and I wasn't leaving it that way either. Still, fear crept in. Where would I sleep tonight? How would I get home? What had I missed that should have warned me? I realized then that this wasn't just about a ticket or a trip. This was about something much older, much deeper, about roles quietly changing while I wasn't looking, about being useful versus being wanted. I took a deep breath and squared my shoulders. Whatever came next, I would face it standing. But as I turned away from the window, one unsettling thought settled heavily in my mind. If this wasn't a mistake, then it was a decision. And that meant the truth I hadn't wanted to see was closer than I thought. What decision had been made long before the airport? And what signs had she ignored that led her here? I didn't notice the pattern at first. Patterns are easy to miss when they arrive disguised as concern. I stood near the window a little longer, watching the planes come and go, and memories began lining up in my mind. Not all at once, not clearly, but like puzzle pieces I'd shoved into a drawer because I didn't like what they might form. It hadn't started at the airport. It had started weeks earlier. Quietly. Politely. After the funeral. People think grief arrives like a storm, loud, violent, impossible to ignore. But mine came like fog. Slow. Soft. Thick enough that I couldn't see where I was stepping. That was when Mark began stopping by more often. First, it felt comforting. He brought groceries I hadn't asked for. Moved things around the house without checking first. Took my mail off the counter and said, "I'll sort this for you, Mom. You don't need the stress." I told myself he was helping. When he asked about my bills, I answered. When he suggested consolidating accounts, I nodded. When Tanya chimed in with ideas about simplifying things, I listened. After all, I was grieving. I didn't want to be difficult. One afternoon, Tanya sat across from me at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone while I poured coffee. "You shouldn't be alone so much," she said casually. "It's not healthy." "I'm managing," I replied. She smiled thinly. "For now." That word stayed with me longer than it should have. For now. Little things followed. They stopped asking and started telling. "We'll handle the bookings. We'll keep the paperwork together. You don't need copies, it's all digital." When I hesitated, Mark would squeeze my shoulder and say, "We're just looking out for you, Mom." And I wanted so badly to believe that. The trip came up one evening after dinner. Mark mentioned it like an afterthought. "Spring break's coming up. We're thinking Florida," he said. "You should come with us. Change of scenery might help." Tanya nodded, already looking pleased with herself. "You've been through a lot." Those words landed gently, comfortingly. I didn't notice how quickly the details slipped out of my hands after that. I offered to help pay because that's what you do when you don't want to feel like a burden. I sold something precious to me to contribute, telling myself it was practical, that memories mattered more than objects. No one stopped me. No one said, "You don't have to." At the airport that morning, everything moved fast. Bags checked together. Boarding passes handled for me. Tanya laughed and said, "Just relax, Blake. We've got it." I let them. Standing there now, hours later, I understood something I hadn't before. Every step had been designed to make me smaller, quieter, easier to manage. easier to leave. A sharp ache settled in my chest, not just grief but recognition. I hadn't been included because I was loved. I had been included because I was convenient. And as that truth settled in, heavier than any suitcase, another realization followed. One that made my fingers curl tightly around my purse. They hadn't just planned the trip. They had planned my absence. What exactly had they planned, and what did they think she would never discover? I left the bench when my legs started to ache, not from standing but from holding myself together. There's a kind of pain that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't scream or knock you to the floor. It simply tightens slowly until you realize you've been clenching your jaw for hours, your fists for years. I walked toward the restroom at the far end of the terminal, the one no one rushes to, the one tucked away like an afterthought. Inside, the lights buzzed softly. I gripped the sink and looked at my reflection. My eyes were red but dry. My mouth pressed into a line I barely recognized. "Pull yourself together," I whispered, not as a command but as a reminder. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't confused. I was hurt, and there's a difference. I splashed water on my face and straightened my sweater. As I reached for a paper towel, I noticed my hands had stopped shaking. That frightened me more than the trembling had. Because calm doesn't come when things are okay. Comes when something inside you has decided. I stepped back into the terminal with clearer eyes. That's when I noticed something I hadn't allowed myself to think about yet. My suitcase. It wasn't lost. It wasn't delayed. It wasn't forgotten. They had taken it. I remembered Tanya's hand resting possessively on the handle at the curb. "We'll check it with ours," she'd said brightly. "Less hassle for you. Less hassle." I let out a slow breath. No clothes. No medication. No photo I'd tucked into the side pocket that morning. This hadn't been impulsive. It had been organized. And suddenly the airport didn't feel like a place of confusion anymore. It felt like a stage where I had played my role exactly as expected. The quiet one. The grateful one. The one who wouldn't make a scene. I sat again, this time near the wall beneath the departure board. I watched the time tick forward, minute by minute, until their flight number flashed. Boarding complete. That's when my phone buzzed. One message. Not from Mark. From an unknown number. "We're through security. Don't worry. Call someone when you land back." When you land back. No apology. No explanation. Just confirmation. Something hardened in my chest. Not anger yet, but resolve. I reached into my purse and finally pulled out the envelope. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't glow or shake. Just paper worn at the edges, folded and unfolded over the years. I stared at it without opening it, knowing what it represented without needing to look inside. This was never meant for comfort. It was meant for moments when trust failed. I slipped the envelope back where it belonged and stood. For the first time since they walked away, I wasn't waiting for anyone to return. I wasn't hoping. I wasn't begging silently for love that had already decided to leave. I walked toward the exit, the sliding doors parting smoothly in front of me, as if the building itself understood. Outside, the air was warm and smelled like asphalt and exhaust. Real. Grounded. I paused just before stepping onto the curb and thought one last, dangerous thought. They believed I would panic. They believed I would fold. They believed wrong. Where was she going with no luggage, no ticket, and an envelope she still refused to open? The curb outside the airport was louder than the terminal. Engines idled. Doors slammed. Drivers shouted names into the air like prayers they hoped would be answered quickly. Everyone was meeting someone. Everyone was leaving with someone. I stood there alone, the automatic doors sliding shut behind me with a final hiss that sounded too much like goodbye. For a moment, fear tried one last time to reclaim me. Not the sharp kind, but the quiet, practical kind that asks reasonable questions. Where will you sleep? What if you misstep? What if you really can't do this alone? I let those questions exist without answering them. Instead, I raised my hand and flagged down the first cab that slowed near the curb. The driver leaned over and rolled down the window. "Where to?" I gave him an address I hadn't said out loud in years. As soon as the words left my mouth, my chest tightened. Not with regret, but with recognition. This place had always existed in the background of my life. A contingency. A quiet safeguard my husband had insisted on, even when I told him he worried too much. Just in case, he'd said. The cab pulled into traffic, the airport shrinking behind us. I watched the glass walls fade into distance, watched planes lift into the sky carrying people who believed they knew exactly where they were going. I didn't. But for the first time all day, I wasn't being carried somewhere by someone else's decision. The city unfolded outside the window. Familiar streets layered with years I hadn't examined closely. Strip malls I remembered from when Mark was small. Intersections where I'd waited at red lights, tapping the steering wheel, life humming along without question. I pressed my palm against my purse, feeling the envelope through the fabric. Still unopened. Still quiet. Still patient. The cab slowed in front of a modest building tucked between two taller offices. Nothing flashy. No grand entrance. Just brass lettering near the door, slightly dulled with age. The driver glanced at me in the mirror. "You sure this is the place?" I nodded. Yes. He didn't rush me when I paid. Didn't hurry me out. Small mercy. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and old coffee. The waiting area was empty except for a ticking clock and a stack of outdated magazines. The woman at the desk looked up and smiled. Not polite, not pitying. Just present. "Can I help you?" I hesitated for half a second. Then I said my name. Something shifted in her expression. Not alarm, not surprise, but recognition. She stood immediately. "Of course. Please have a seat." As I sat, my heart began to pound. Not because I was afraid of what would happen next, but because I knew I was crossing a line I could never uncross. Whatever I said here would make things real. Permanent. The door to the inner office opened. A man stepped out, older now, slower than I remembered, but his eyes were the same. Sharp. Steady. Kind in a way that didn't mistake softness for weakness. He looked at me for a long moment. "I'm glad you came," he said quietly. So was I. Because walking into this office meant something important. I had stopped waiting for them to choose me. What did she come here to change? And why would it shatter everything her family thought they knew? The office door closed softly behind us. Not dramatically. Not with finality. Just a quiet click, like a boundary being set. He gestured for me to sit. I did, folding my hands in my lap the way I always had when something serious was about to be discussed. Old habits don't disappear just because your life cracks open. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He didn't rush me. Didn't fill the silence. Didn't ask questions that assumed answers. That alone told me I was in the right place. "I wasn't expecting to see you today," he said finally. "But I'm not surprised either." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "I didn't plan this," I said. "At least not today." He nodded slowly. Most turning points don't send invitations. I reached into my purse and removed the envelope. Not quickly. Not ceremoniously. Just honestly. I placed it on the desk between us like a fragile thing that could cut if handled wrong. "I haven't opened it," I said. "I know," he replied. That stopped me. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. Some things are understood by people who've spent their lives preparing for the day others realize they've been cornered. I looked around the office. Shelves of neatly labeled files, framed certificates, a photo on the wall of him shaking hands with a much younger version of my husband. That picture tightened something in my chest. "He told me you'd come someday," he said gently. He just didn't know when. The room felt suddenly smaller, warmer, heavier with memory. "I don't want revenge," I said quickly, afraid of how this might sound. "I don't want to hurt anyone." He studied me carefully. "What do you want?" The question was simple. The answer was not. "I want to stop being treated like I don't exist unless I'm useful," I said. "I want what's mine to stop being managed." He nodded once. "Then we start there." He slid a folder across the desk, thin, familiar. My name typed neatly on the tab. "We won't rush," he continued. "But we will be thorough." We talked not about the airport, not yet, but about structures. Names. Access. Decisions that had been made quietly over time, without my full understanding. With every sentence, something became clearer. This hadn't been one betrayal. It had been a series of assumptions layered so neatly they almost looked like care. When he finally opened the envelope himself, I didn't look away. Inside were numbers. Notes. Instructions written in my husband's careful handwriting. Not fear-driven. Prepared. I felt something shift, not in the room but in me. Because in that moment I understood something vital. I hadn't been left unprotected. I had just been waiting too long to use the protection. He closed the folder gently. "We can make changes," he said. "Effective immediately." My heart pounded. "Some of them," he added, "will surprise people." I nodded. "That's all right." Outside the office, the world continued as if nothing had happened. But inside that room a future was being rewritten line by line, name by name. And somewhere far away, people who thought they had already won were about to learn something they never expected. I had a voice, and I was finally ready to use it. What changes were set into motion that day? And when the truth reached her family, who would really be left behind? The room was too quiet. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that makes every breath sound louder than it should. Chairs were arranged in a neat row, untouched. A long table sat at the front, polished to a dull shine, as if reflection itself had been scrubbed away. This was the room from the beginning, the place I hadn't expected to enter again. I arrived early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to see their faces when they walked in and found me already seated. The envelope was no longer sealed. The papers were no longer silent. And I was no longer invisible. When the door opened, they came in together. Voices, low, movements rehearsed. Mark first, then my daughter-in-law, then the attorney they had chosen, not realizing how carefully the ground beneath them had already shifted. Mark froze. Just for a second. Just long enough. His eyes flicked to the chair I occupied, to the folder in front of me, to the way I sat. Upright, calm, no longer bracing myself for dismissal. "Mom," he said, like the word had lost its instructions. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence do what it had always done for me. Only this time it worked in my favor. "I thought you were resting," my daughter-in-law said carefully. "I was," I replied. Then I woke up. The attorney cleared his throat and began flipping through his notes. "Shall we begin?" "Yes," I said. "But not the way you planned." I slid a document across the table. Not forcefully, not dramatically, just decisively. "I've already met with counsel," I continued. "Independent counsel." Mark's chair scraped as he shifted. "Why would you do that?" I met his eyes. "Because I should have years ago." The attorney picked up the document, brows knitting as he read. The color drained slowly from his face. Not panic, not shock, but recognition. This was real. This was binding. This was not a misunderstanding to be smoothed over later. "These changes," he said carefully, "are effective." "I know," I replied. Mark stood. "This doesn't make sense." "Dad wouldn't." "He did," I said quietly. "He planned for this moment. You just didn't expect me to step into it." No one spoke. They had expected confusion, weakness, gratitude for whatever scraps were offered. They had not expected clarity. I gathered my things and stood, not because the meeting was over, but because I was. "I'm not here to punish anyone," I said. "But I won't be managed. I won't be spoken for. And I won't disappear to make things easier." Mark swallowed. "So what happens now?" I considered the question. "Now," I said, "we start telling the truth." I walked past them, heels steady against the floor. The door opened easily. As I stepped into the hallway, I realized something profound. The moment they thought I was weakest was the moment I finally remembered who I was. If this story moved you like it, if it reminded you of someone who deserves their voice back, share it. And if you believe it's never too late to reclaim your place, subscribe. Because silence is not the same as absence. And some awakenings change everything.